Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sophia Silao, and I am Program Officer of the Special Projects Fund at the New York Health Foundation. Welcome. Today's webinar will focus on mental health in the Asian American Pacific Islander API community. This session is part of New York Health's ongoing efforts to build knowledge around effective practices that can make a positive impact on the health and well-being of all New Yorkers. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Your microphone and cameras have been turned off to ensure optimal audio and visual quality for today's session. We do, however, want to hear from you. Drop your name and your affiliation in the chat box to let us know who is in this virtual space. This webinar is also being recorded, and a recap of today's session, along with copies of the slides, will be posted on our website a few days after today. Closed captioning is also available for those who need it. Before we hear from today's speaker, I think it's important to note that there's no single Asian American or Pacific Islander experience. Dr. Sumi Okazaki from New York University sums it up perfectly when she wrote that the API communities are made up of people from diverse national origins, pre- and post-migration histories, languages, cultural traditions, religious faiths, geopolitical entanglements with the US, as well as other colonizing powers. And I think it's important to contextualize this. And although we as Asian Americans are not monolithic, we have shared experiences that arise out of being identified as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the US. Despite being one of the fastest growing racial and ethnic groups in the country, there is a shortage of mental health programming in the API community. And this was the reality even before COVID. Mental health needs have risen exponentially in the past few years, and compounded by a fear of COVID infection, loss of loved ones, social isolation, and anxiety arising from hate crimes and xenophobic attacks against Asians across the country. The need for culturally and linguistically appropriate care is great. Today, we're joined by Joo Han, Deputy Director of Asian American Federation, who will provide an overview about the current state of mental health in the API community, the barriers to accessing services, and what providers and community members can do to support their needs. After her introduction and her brief overview, I'll then open it up for discussion and Q&A. And as you listen to Joo, I invite you to drop your comments and questions in the chat box, and I'll make sure to incorporate them into our discussion. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Joo.
Hi, everybody. I was going to say good morning, but it's already 12. I don't know where the time flies. Really happy to be here with all of you today. I'm hoping, I can't really see any of you, but I'm hoping this can be a dialogue. But I do want to give you some context for my organization, the Asian American Federation, and the work that we've been doing and as it relates to mental health at this point, I would say for the past 6 to 7 years. But especially it's become very relevant during COVID and during this time of anti-Asian violence. So please feel free to engage with me in the chat, and I want to give you some information. And then at the very end, I'll also be sharing some resources around the work that we're doing. With that, I'm going to share my screen. So we have been working to support the mental health of Asian New Yorkers since 2017. The Asian American Federation, we've been around for close to 35 years. We are an umbrella leadership organization that represents 70 member and partner organizations here in New York that serve the 1.5 million Asian New Yorkers. Most of our members are downstate here in New York City, but we do have a number of upstate groups that we have also been engaging with through our census civic engagement work, as well as the support that we're doing around social services up there. Ultimately, our mission is advocating for better policies and better services, and ultimately more funding for Asian immigrants, because we are the fastest growing population, but there are a host of challenges that we face here in New York. The Asian American Federation, we were the first organization to respond to the surge in anti-Asian violence in January of 2020. So even before we went into lockdown, we were hearing from small business owners that we support that they had been lost all their customers after the anti-immigrant rhetoric coming from former President Trump at that time. While anti-Asian violence is not one of our priority areas, was not before COVID, it has been now because there has just been very little support in helping victims and also people witnessing violence here in New York. I also want to mention before we move on, the priority areas that we work on are anti-Asian violence, it's mental health, it's senior services, it's civic engagement, senior services, and all of this is powered by the research that we do, and as well as our various working groups that really help us to understand what are the fast-growing needs and urgent needs of the Asian community in New York. So I want to give you some stats to give you a little bit of context for who we serve through our member and partner organizations. One, we are the fastest growing population here in New York City, as well as New York State, as well as the US. We now comprise 17% of the city's population. We just had a member convening this morning with our groups, and our research team was presenting on the data that really shows the different demographics of the Asian community in New York City that I encourage you to check out our website, aafederation.org. You can look at the growth. It's an interactive site, so you can also put in for limited English proficiency rates, poverty rates, education, all those factors that we think about as we try to better understand this fast-growing population. It's also important to note that 2/3 of us are foreign-born immigrants, which means that there may be language access and other access challenges. 44%, right? So nearly half of us don't speak English proficiently, which again means that there may be barriers to accessing services. And when you actually look at the Asian senior population, that jumps to 72% limited English proficiency. It's also important to note that more than a third of us are considered low income or living in poverty. That statistic was 25% before COVID, and because of the rampant job loss in service industries where many Asian New Yorkers work in, that poverty rate has jumped to an alarming 35%. Which means that a lot of folks and families are experiencing food insecurity, access to health insurance, just overall have experienced more economic instability in the past 3 years. Also, maybe important to know, Chinese, Indian, and Korean communities are the 3 largest ethnic communities here in New York, but some of the fastest growing populations are not necessarily the largest, like Bangladeshi community, for example, is one of the fastest growing communities here in New York, which means that we also want to keep in mind the services that we're providing to respond to that growth. I point out this statistic, which is that Asians own nearly 20% of businesses here in New York and generate nearly $121 billion in economic activity, but they've received very little support from city and state to support their businesses, which during COVID had a huge impact on the survival of Asian small businesses, which really has impacted the mental health of small business owners who oftentimes are the main breadwinners for their families and have impacted just anxiety and stress throughout the community. I want to give you an overview of the Asian AAPI mental health state here in New York. It's important to note that Asian Americans experience higher rates of depression compared to their white counterparts. Compared to the national average of 13%, only 2% of Asians will report depression symptoms to their doctor. And overall mental illness is underreported in Asian communities. We're the least likely ethnic group in the US to report mental illness. We are also the least likely of groups to utilize mental health services, which are often mainstream, often non-culturally competent. And suicide is a leading cause of death of Asian Americans, particularly for Asian women ages 20 to 24 and 65 and older. They have the highest suicide rate among all racial groups. About a third of Asian women ages 20 to 24 lose their lives to suicide. And again, women 65 and older have some of the highest depression rates of all racial and ethnic groups, particularly in the Japanese community, which is important disaggregated information that we should keep in mind. Something that really impacted mental health during COVID, and if you think about, again, COVID in it doesn't exist in a vacuum in itself, right? Before that, we had 4 years of anti-immigrant policies under the Trump administration, right? So there's a host of just challenges that our community has faced. On top of that, on top of the pandemic, we had anti-Asian violence. So some national information I want to share. There's over 11,000 reports of anti-Asian incidents were reported between March of 2020 to 2022, which means that in the past year, of course, that number has increased. While the majority of incidents are verbal harassment, still 17% of incidents were physical violence throughout the US. I think what's also important to note that from 2020 to 2021, the rate of physical violence actually doubled in percentage rate compared to in that 1 year time period, which is has been, as you may have seen in the news, something that people are still experiencing, even though the media attention is not as fixed on this issue. New York City has a dubious distinction of being the city with the greatest number of reported assaults here in the US. While California has the most number as a state, New York City is the city with the most number of reported assaults, which means that, again, we need to make sure that there are resources to respond to this. We, not only us, but Stop API Hate, which is a reporting site, as well as NYPD, as well as other reporting sites, as including ours, we saw over 2,600 incidents of anti-Asian bias as of March 2022, over a year ago, which means that number has definitely increased during that time. Also, the NYPD reported there's been a 343% increase in anti-Asian attacks from 2020 to 2021, and there have been recent incidents in 2023, as recently as 2023, that I think, again, really point to the fact that people are still living in a lot of fear and anxiety that this is continuing to happen. And overall, know these numbers as high as they are, they tend to be significantly underreported. Hate crimes generally only 10 to 30% of actual incidents get reported, which means that most people are not getting the help that they need, whether it's pro bono legal services, reporting assistance, mental health, or other victim support services. There are some barriers, right? People say, why are Asian Americans, API folks, not seeking mental health? There's stigma, based on the 2017 mental health report that we produced with the support from the New York Health Foundation. Stigma continues to be the #1 reason, or the #1 deterrent to seeking mental health services for the Asian community. So many folks in the Asian community don't see mental health as a legitimate health concern. So that deters them from seeking help, as they might for a physical ailment where they would go to a doctor for help. There's just a lack of capacity for linguistically and culturally competent mental health services, even in New York, right? We have worked with a number of mental health partners, but there continues to be much more demand, especially during COVID. That demand really jumped compared to the scale of services that were available. So that lack of investment continues to play out in the fact that not everybody is getting the support that they need. And access to mental health services for a number of reasons that I mentioned before, whether it's poverty, right? It's being underinsured, uninsured, knowing where to seek services, knowing where there might be culturally competent services, again, is something that continues to be a barrier. And then the fact that there's just a lack of research into appropriate mental health care models and service models that work for our community has not been funded. So oftentimes any funding opportunities out there are for clinically proven models that oftentimes that's not the first place where Asians seek help. And so there's lack of funding to support some of the service models that our groups are using to show that they are effective in providing some kind of preventative care. I want to talk a little bit of just kind of distill it for you. What is available in terms of services? And I can talk really specifically about the Federation's work versus the gaps that continue to plague us and that we do have to address. So with help, again, from support from the New York Health Foundation, we've been able to convene the Asian American Mental Health Roundtable. It's the only Asian-led, Asian-serving coalition of groups working to address mental health needs in the Asian community. There's 12 groups providing both clinical and non-clinical services. We come together on a quarterly basis to share challenges, solutions, and also to be able to share resources that might work across organizations to support the growing need. We also, in the past year, launched our mental health directory. This is a unique directory in that it is very much focused on access, not only in terms of making cultural competent providers, but also in terms of including providers that are either free, sliding scale, or more affordable. And also that language access is a huge piece. So please check out our mental health directory. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but there are many languages and many different types of clinical, non-clinical providers on our directory, which again, we were able to create with support from the foundation. Our Hope Against Hate campaign, 33 groups that are working to address anti-Asian violence. I'll also share with you some of the work that we're doing when, if you are serving clients or community members, family, friends who are experiencing or witnessing anti-Asian violence and mental health impact from that, groups that you can refer them to be able to get some sort of support in response to this crisis. So that's what's available. And we do have among our 12 groups, there's a handful of clinical clinics that provide mental health services in Asian languages. But what's also challenging is that there's just been such a lack of investment in Asian nonprofits providing mental health services. We did a report years ago that looked at 13 years of funding from the city and saw that Asian organizations were the most underfunded by the city, and particularly the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, DOHMH, compared to our share of the population, they had the lowest rate of investment of all city agencies, which really has a real life impact, which is that our groups cannot provide the level of services that they'd like to provide. And then the fact that non-clinical models just generally aren't funded by the philanthropic community. Oftentimes they want to see, are you providing clinical models that have been tested, tried and true? And when we've said, hey, these are not models that would work because therapy, again, is not usually the first place where people seek help. They're not eligible to get funding for mental health work that is culturally competent. And then also important to note is that mainstream services that do exist don't necessarily work for our community. There was a whole big to-do around the National Mental Health Hotline that was rolled out nationally. There's the city version of it, which is New York City Well, but by New York City Well's own admission, they had to put out a report several years ago about how Asians were the least likely to seek to use that mental health hotline. And if they did, they had the worst experience out of all racial and ethnic users who did to call the hotline. So again, there's so much billions of dollars being invested in models that might not work for our community. So we want to make sure that we create alternative models of service that people can access. So that's a backdrop to the work that we're doing, as well as the state of mental health. And then I know I will be talking with Sophia a little bit about what is specifically the work that we're doing and things that we should be keeping in mind as we approach this work.
Thank you so much, Joo. That really sets the stage quite nicely for our discussion, and very helpful background. I didn't know about the 988 number. So again, a reminder to everyone, please send us your questions through the chat box, and I'll make sure to incorporate that as we move on with our discussion. So let me just start us off by asking you, Joo, you know, one of the things that we talked about prior to this webinar was we talked about the concept of the model minority myth, and how it affects service delivery for the API community. So for folks who aren't as familiar with this, can you explain what this is and then how it affects mental health and, you know, mental health services for members of the API community?
Sure. So the model minority myth is something that, right, it plagues us to this day. It was created in the 60s by a sociologist that essentially said, oh, Asians are doing so well. Look at the Japanese Americans after their internment, how they're providing success or they're achieving success, kind of being able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But again, the social construct was used as a way to denigrate Black Americans, saying that, oh, after centuries of slavery, why can't they get their act together? And it was false. It was a false construct, right? As I shared with you that data, poverty is something that is a real concern in our community. This model minority myth paints erroneously this picture that Asian Americans, AAPI, are doing really well, highly educated, highly successful. They do not need help. They are self-sufficient, which we know is not the case, right? And how that plays out, one is it becomes a racial wedge, right? Using Asians as a racial wedge between all racial communities, when we know it's not true. There's systemic inequities, racism that exists that does deter people from seeking help. There is also a cultural piece where Asians feel that they have to be self-sufficient. We're not really in the practice of asking for help. And when you see this picture of, oh, everyone should be doing well and everyone is successful, it keeps people from asking for help. So even during the Trump administration, when people needed access to health insurance, we had so many of our providers saying people were refusing. One, there was a fear of seeking public benefits because of the potential backlash. There was a lot of misinformation, but it also kept people from saying, I actually am having food insecurity, I've lost my job, I've lost health insurance, can you help me? And then the most vulnerable people are not getting access to those services, which are their right to seek and to receive. And also, it paints this picture of our community doesn't need funding, right? I talked about how there's been such a lack of investment from the philanthropic community, as well as city and state, around investing in systems that work for our community. But it's oftentimes fallen on deaf ears because people think, oh, you all are doing well. What do you mean? And I think it's important to note that in the Asian community, we have the largest income disparity of any racial and ethnic group across the country. So you have some that are, yes, highly educated and successful, but we also, that gap between those at the top and those at the bottom is huge, is the widest gap. And we have those who, certain communities have low educational attainment, are living in poverty, as I mentioned, and no one is there. We're an invisible minority to begin with, but I think even among the Asian community, we have more invisible groups that actually do struggle and came over as refugees, never got the help that they needed, and oftentimes are kind of shut out because of the lack of access.
Yeah, the other thing that also struck me in your, your overview was very common theme: lack of capacity for organizations to properly serve the API community. And so in terms of, I'm kind of thinking about like different creative ways to ensure that the needs of the community are met. And the concept of task sharing as a project design model, where non-clinical staff or lay people are trained in different ways to screen or connect individuals to mental health services. That was something that I was thinking about. And I know this is a particularly effective strategy that has worked in the API community, especially for certain subgroups like older adults, more recent immigrants, where talking about mental health is really like more of a taboo. I'd love to hear more from you about, some creative or more culturally appropriate strategies that your member organizations have used to sort of elicit these kinds of conversations with their members.
I think our groups, and I think we have our mental health partners, they provide a mix of clinical and non-clinical. And I think it's for us, the purpose always is, how do we create multiple points of access to receiving mental health care? So even our clinical providers, like Hamilton Medicine House, the way they even approach clinical services, because there are people with severe and chronic illnesses that do need mental health support, and therapy does work for some folks in our community. They know that having family involved is really important. So they have a lot of family support for caregivers to ensure that individuals who do have mental illness their family members are supportive and understand their conditions. But also we have our non-clinical providers who understand that for the most part, especially for immigrants who are not familiar with therapy, they're not going to go and seek therapy. So they want to provide ways that people can be open to this idea, to destigmatize this idea of seeking mental health care. So there's psychoeducation that happens. There's also a lot of integrating mental health concepts in existing services. So our groups that provide senior services know that isolation and maybe tied to depression can be a contributing factor to struggles that our senior population has. So may integrate tea time, origami folding as a way to get people to come for a social aspect of that activity, but we'll have a program staff who may facilitate conversations around what's been causing you some stress lately. And oftentimes in those conversations, things might come up of, I'm afraid to go outside, and I really, I don't have support, and some of the things that we know to be a fact, but really anecdotally getting more information. We also have youth serving groups that talk about identity development and also introduce mental health concepts for Asian youth, especially during, you think about COVID and anti-Asian violence, as well as anti-immigrant policies that happened during Trump, we want to make sure that kids grow up with a sense of context, historical context. So why is this happening? So it doesn't feel personal, like something is wrong with me and I'm being personally targeted. They learn about the history of anti-Asian violence here in the US, talk about how it's not personal, how these are model minority myth, how their concepts around yellow peril, things that to this day still play out and really do impact the way our kids are growing up, especially with social media. A lot of what they're absorbing is content through social media that's just misinformed. And then we also do have, if we have some of our groups have clinical staff, they will train non-clinical staff, potentially maybe working with DV survivors, domestic violence survivors, on administering the PHQ, the 9 assessment around depression, and then be able to, again, introduce anything around whether it's like women's support groups, senior support groups, being able to introduce spaces where people can share, especially as collective cultures. It's a little bit less intimidating to share as a group, and when there's trust versus going to see a therapist or clinician as a first point. So a lot of groups doing through these non-clinical ways will then identify clients who actually may need clinical help, and then do have partners that they can refer their community members to, so that there is support, wraparound support all around.
Great. Yeah, I'm definitely, I'm finding that these types of strategies are prevalent in even my own friend circles. So a question that came in that I wanted to pose to you is, so community-based organizations interested in adopting more inclusive mental health programming, but aren't necessarily Asian focused organizations. What are some hallmarks or suggestions that you have for them to think about in building effective mental health programming?
That is a challenging question, because oftentimes Asian community members, especially when you're thinking about folks who've been, even if they've been here, but language access continues to be a challenge, they will go to community-based organizations that they know of because culturally it's familiar. And we've heard feedback where people were like, I'm so relieved to talk to somebody who understands my culture. There's a lot of that, right? So I do think it's not just a sort of attacking on. If I think mainstream providers need to understand the context and where a lot of the Asian community members are coming from, and that they are really invested, are they willing to make the investment in hiring staff and provide cultural programming that really does respond to the Asian community members. And I know oftentimes, I'm thinking about upstate especially, there are really fast growing Asian populations. We just did a summit with a senator up in Rochester a few weeks ago, where we were looking at particularly the poverty rates in that area were 50%, right? And there might not be a lot of nonprofit capacity to serve those groups. So it may oftentimes fall on mainstream providers to start to respond to that. And I would say it's important to partner with a local, whether it's cultural or faith-based organizations, to get some understanding of that community and having that partnership to build out services with someone who speaks the language to actually provide meaningful mental health support. And again, not therapy right away, although that would be great to have that as an offering, but understanding too that you can't talk directly about mental health. A lot of Asian community members, it has to be sort of around wellness, or some ways that our groups have done it is doing parenting classes. A lot of parents have obviously been concerned about the COVID fallout on their kids and want to know how better to support them. So mental parenting classes or parenting workshops is a natural way not only talk about supporting the wellness of our kids, but also how parents' mental health might affect their kids. So I do think it's important if mainstream providers who are not traditionally serving Asian community members to really partner with a local nonprofit or a faith-based organization or a cultural organization to really understand the needs, and then to build out culturally competent programming that is responsive to what different. Again, not mental health needs are not, again, uniform across Asian community members. Refugee communities are going to be experiencing PTSD at rates much higher than other community members. So it's also important to note the nuances of mental health challenges that different communities are facing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a follow-up question that we received sort of touching on the same theme. Are there any mental health training curriculum that exists that kind of helps, that could be helpful in building more culturally competent mental health services?
We, so I'll talk about a round table. I mentioned it earlier, which we do have partners that we work with to provide several times a year culturally competent training. So even similar to backdrop of what is the context of the communities that might be in your particular areas. And again, because I forgot to mention this, which is important. We are the only census information center for the Asian community in the Northeast, which means that we have access to data and we produce data that looks at in New York City, New York State, the specific demographics of specific metropolitan areas. So we do provide that cultural competency training around what is the population in your different areas? How do you address mental health in a way that might be accessible? What are some challenges that you also need to be aware of going in? So I would definitely, if you're interested, please, you're welcome to reach out to me. We on our website, aafederation.org. You have access to sign up for our newsletter. We oftentimes offer that because it's in our best interest. We know that we have to work together with existing systems, hospitals, with mainstream providers to create wider and greater points of access for Asian community members. And it's not even in New York State where I feel like we're well resourced compared to upstate regions. I would say a lot of public hospitals and use our mental health partners for referral. So there's not enough capacity even within hospitals where we want to be able to do some preventative work, but by the time people go to the hospitals, it's they've reached a crisis point. So there's also a lot of preventative work that needs to be done so that people, because of lack of awareness and knowledge around what is mental health symptoms and illness look like, that they're not waiting till to the point where they're on the verge of a breakdown and have to be admitted to the hospital.
Thank you. So I want to make sure that we carve out enough time for you to talk about the Hope Against Hate campaign and then also your mental health directory, which is fabulous, phenomenal, and I can't say enough good things about it. So Joo, do you want to talk a little bit about your Hope Against
Sure.
Hate campaign?
Do you want me to share the resources or at the very end, or just kind of talk a little bit about the work as
whatever you feel like.
Okay. I think I will share resources. I think it's rather than repeat myself. So I'm going to share my screen. And then I'll just talk through this work that we've been doing as it relates to mental health. I talked earlier about our Anti-Asian Violence program and the fact that we were the first group to respond. We quickly created our Hope Against Hate campaign because we realized in talking to a lot of city and state officials, there just wasn't anything built out to provide safety for Asian New Yorkers. So we felt, in addition to the advocacy that we're doing and community education that we're doing, is really important to actually build out a crisis response system to keep our most vulnerable members safe. So there's 4 different project areas that we really provide support around. We have 33 groups that we work with across New York City and some groups in upstate New York to provide some of these services. We coordinate the reporting of bias incidents so that people can report when they're not comfortable going to the NYPD or law enforcement. Most people are not comfortable going to law enforcement for a number of reasons. I talked about language access. There's 15% of our communities undocumented. It hasn't been safe for them to interact with government or law enforcement. And also, there just isn't that trust. There's oftentimes where people have gone to law enforcement, they've been dismissed and made to feel that what they were experiencing wasn't very important. So there's been just word of mouth is obviously something that people put a lot of value in. So when there's other community members who said they really haven't helped me, it discourages them. But we want people to report because if people aren't reporting, 1, we don't know the scale of the problem, and 2, people don't know where to go for support, and then they're suffering on their own. So we have on our website a reporting site in English and 7 Asian languages, but we also point people to different groups that they can go to depending on language where they can go and report. We also have been working on a program called Community Companion Program, where we recruit and train volunteers across New York or in Asian majority neighborhoods to serve as safety experts. So these volunteers can be from the community. They don't have to be from the community. We think that safety for New Yorkers means safety for Asian New Yorkers means safety for all New Yorkers, because we know that hate violence as a whole has just surged during COVID. And we train them in de-escalation strategies, situational awareness, to be able to canvass neighborhoods and serve as a safety presence for folks so that, people know that if they're there, that they're equipped to de-escalate situations, and that, they can be a resource for people who are not feeling safe to walk around by themselves. And these volunteers are also available to provide escort. So if there are seniors who say, I really need to go to the doctors, but I don't feel safe, can you connect me to a volunteer? We also have these volunteers who are willing to provide these protective services so that people can have quality of life. I think the saddest thing that I heard in the thick of COVID was being in a Zoom with like 20 Korean seniors who said, I've just accepted the fact that my life is just not going to be the same as it was, because I can't leave my house without my kids and my husband because I'm so scared of being assaulted. And I thought that was a saddest statement. It reminded me of my own mother, who's a Korean elder, and it broke my heart to think that people felt they had to be sequestered in their own homes just to have a sense of safety, which I thought was incredibly unfair and unrealistic. We also have victim support services that our groups provide. We've had a number of people come to us directly, but many people that our community groups support victims who have experienced both verbal and or physical violence. We connect them to pro bono legal services, which is the number one thing that people ask for, especially if they've been physically assaulted or have been threatened with physical violence. We also connect them to our mental health partners if they want to talk to somebody just because they have a lot of trauma from what has happened. We also connect them to free Uber rides because they may not feel comfortable, especially in the past year. We saw Asian women and other, just in general, public transit, people being assaulted. They don't feel comfortable taking the subway or the train to go to doctors and work and things like that. And then safety trainings is one of the offerings that we also provide in language. I forget the number, but I know that we've served we've trained thousands of Asian and non-Asian New Yorkers in ways that they can de-escalate situations, keep themselves safe in different Asian languages so that people know how to access that information. And we've done that across New York City and New York State. So those are resources that we want to be able to share with folks. I think even people who've been educated here and know the language have said, I didn't know where to go to until I got connected to the Hope Against Hate partners. And then I got connected to all these services that I felt before I felt so hopeless and helpless, but having this access makes me feel like there's people who care about my well-being and being able to recover from this violent incident. So these are, I talked a little bit about this earlier, just summary wise, but here are the actual numbers and links where you can go to report. If you know someone who's been a victim of anti-Asian violence, there's safety booklets and resources and videos that we've created that I forgot to mention. That way that people who can't come to all our trainings, we have booklets in, I think now, not only these languages, I think we also have in Arabic, in Thai, and Hindi, and Urdu, all the South Asian languages on physical self-defense, upstandard de-escalation, conflict de-escalation strategies that you can find on our website. And if you email me, I'm also happy to point you to physical booklets that we have. And then we also have videos for people to keep themselves physically safe. And those are all in the different languages that are up here: Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Tagalog, and Vietnamese. Legal support, if you've experienced physical violence or you know someone who has, we have a network of pro bono law firms who provide pro bono legal services to kind of walk you through what your options might be. And then last but not least, as I mentioned, our mental health directory, which includes our mental health partners, but a number of other organizations and providers that take insurance, maybe sliding scale, potentially are free, and then are cost affordable or cost effective for folks who need mental health support. And then I'll say that last one for the end in terms of what you can do.
Do you want to show us a little bit about the mental health directory? Because I think that's actually a really great resource.
Sure. We built this out during COVID. It's on our website. If you even go to aafederation.org, you'll see a link for our mental health directory. And we are really invested and excited about building this out. So we are now at over 200 providers. If you go on to this link, you'll see where all the different providers are located throughout New York. And we have folks, or essentially for providers who are not providing physical services but are doing Zoom. They're not on this map, but they are also captured in our directory. So you can actually search by the type of clinical service that you or maybe the client that you're serving may need access to, different psychotherapy specialties and types. We also have where you can filter by non-clinical services, right? You'll see acupuncture, acupressure, aromatherapy, breath work, career coaching, chakra balancing, all the different non-clinical ways that domestic violence counseling that people may want to access wellness services that aren't all clinical. You can search by borough, you can search by language. Again, I mentioned that we have 19 Asian languages represented on the directory, but if you include all the Arabic and Chinese dialects, we have 34 overall languages and dialects represented. So, and we are looking to build this out. And in the next year, our focus is also to add on upstate providers who we can capture for the Asian community members. And then types of payments, insurance-wise, sliding scale, as well as age groups. And then if there's preference around gender of the providers themselves. So you can search, and then you'll see that the ones that are in beige are organizations, and the ones that are in orange are actual individual providers. So we hope that you not only come and access that directory, we have it in mind, obviously, for people themselves, but really we also think it's a resource for providers who can help their clients connect to the right people to support them. And then if you are and you know of providers who'd like to be added to our directory, you can go to our directory and there's a link also to complete the form to be added.
That's great. And so you did say that there's going to be a phase 2 to this for the upstate region, right?
Right. Yeah, we're this year, for the next year, we're really focusing on how to add upstate providers, because again, our partners, there's a number of partners that we have up there, and we're actually probably working with close to 40 groups in Long Island and upstate that we're hoping that can give us some access to providers that we can add to this directory as well.
Very cool. So did you want to share your last
I
slide?
can. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can do. People are always like, what can I do? And I think there's, we have a few action items that I'll share with you. So one is, I think I mentioned this earlier, but I do think it's important, right? Even for Asian community members, for me, our research team just did a presentation this morning. I was sometimes a little surprised. I was surprised that our poverty rate jumped 10 percentage points during COVID. Like things like that are really important. So I really do encourage you to check out our reports and our interactive research page on our website to learn more about that. And you can search by area. So if you're thinking particularly about where you're at, which borough you're in, where you serve, that's where you can get information about where you're seeing growth, limited English proficiency, poverty rates, etc. I talked a little bit about slideshow. Our Hope Against Hate campaign. We think it's really, there's two things. We think it's really important for all New Yorkers to be upstanders. If you remember some of the really sort of tragic stories that happened when there was a lot of media attention, there was a man by the name of Noel Quintana, who was a Filipino man who got slashed from ear to ear on the subway. And he had to stumble to an attendant at the next stop to be able to get help because no one came to his aid. And he said, I asked myself, why didn't anyone help me? And oftentimes it's not that people don't want to help, they just don't know how to help, and they're afraid, especially when there is violence involved. So we have series of upstander trainings that we do with our really critical training partner, Nonviolent Peace Force. But we also have self-defense training, because it's not about self-defense as not being like someone who's going to go and attack the whole idea of self-defense as a definition is how do you get yourself to safety? How do you create a moment of pause so that you can find a way to exit that situation so you're no longer at risk to physical risk to yourself. So physical risk in the situation where you're being targeted. So we do have today, if anyone is free, we do have an empowerment self-defense class in person, which I think is always more powerful than Zoom, at the LGBT Center, which I think is near Union Square, from 6:30 to 8:30. We have space if you want to register at bit.ly, this bit.ly link, Empowerment 101 CE2. We hope you'll come. I always feel, I've been to a number of those, but I feel like every time I go, it's so, one, great to be in community with folks who really care about safety and you don't feel alone. And then secondly, just understanding what self-defense means and how people have walked away saying, I really feel hopeful because before this, I really didn't know that I had any agency to keep myself safe. So we hope you'll come. And you can also volunteer or learn more about becoming a community companion, not only about being trained in de-escalation, being placed in Asian majority neighborhoods and providing escort services. It also means that you could provide translation services. It also means that you could run errands for seniors who aren't afraid to go out on their own. So there's a lot of different roles that I think community companions can serve. And we just need more people who are willing to give their time and energy for that work. And you can learn more at our website, but also the link that I know the slide deck will be shared with you all afterwards.
Yeah, no, thank you, Joo. Oftentimes, you know, folks really want to be able to help, but they don't know how. And so, thank you for sharing that information. And again, I did drop in the chat box the link to the mental health directory for folks who want to access that. And I want to, we're hitting up against time, and I want to give folks one last opportunity to put in their questions if they have any. Before we go into the end of our session. Joo, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think I did. I know someone just mentioned about the woman in Brooklyn who had acid thrown in her face too. I think one of the things I do want to mention and why it's important that information gets out to folks around resources is that in most cases, the definition of what constitutes a hate crime, the bar is very high. So most incidents will not be categorized as a hate crime. So if no words were uttered, even again, if something happened to somebody, the NYP is gonna be like, it's not a hate crime. Even when words are uttered, it's harassment. There's very little that the NYPD can do. So I feel like I was just saying, ironically, I was on my way to a AAPI panel a few weeks ago where I was also verbally assaulted in the lobby of the building. But people often will say, go back to your country, you know, you chink and all those, none of those things rise to the level of a hate crime. But bias incidents, why those verbal assaults are important to take note of is that it still creates such a feeling of lack of safety in walking out. In New York City, we're such a walking city, everyone's out in public spaces. Most of these incidents are happening in the streets and public transit. It's keeping people from living their lives. So I do think that it's important to know, we don't want to get to the point of the Noel Quintanas of the world. We don't want to get to a point where the Atlanta shootings happened and we lost. And we know just recently the Texas mall shootings, the shooter was someone who had held anti-Asian beliefs. And so we don't want to get to a point where people are losing their lives and they're experiencing physical injuries. So it is really important for all providers, Asian serving or not, to be aware of resources. And oftentimes because of language access, but also there's sometimes shame in it too, is that people won't readily offer when they've been assaulted. So a lot of our providers, it's not people, some will come to them and say, hey, I experienced this, but for the most part, it actually comes out in conversation when they're being helped with enrolling in health insurance, helping them access, you know, food benefits, that it will come out, oh, I was assaulted, my friend or my family member were assaulted. So if it reaches the news, that's become a pinnacle point of violence, but so many things happen every day where people are experiencing, and as providers, right, even Asian nonprofit staff were experiencing such egregious levels of verbal and physical assault, and they're also supporting people who have experiences. It's been traumatic for our community members. So we also, through our mental health program, try to provide support for mental health for Asian nonprofit staff, because there's so much burnout and trauma in our community from the past 3 years.
Yeah, no, I thank you for really highlighting that, the importance of, you know, the connection between public safety and repeated trauma, systemic trauma that really leads to mental health crisis for a community that often can feel invisible. So we've basically run out of time. So I wanted to thank you, Joo, for this very helpful, engaging conversation. And thank you to everyone for jumping onto this webinar. We hope that it provokes some thought and promotes discussion within your organizations about different ways to incorporate culturally and linguistically focused services in your work, and to sort of prompt folks to think about ways that you can partner with other organizations to support this. Special thanks to Erica Van Boxtel and Stephanie Fong from our communications team for their behind the scenes work on this webinar. And I also want to put in a plug for an upcoming New York Health Conference on peer support programs for military veterans. If you or anyone you know is interested in learning more about this topic, we invite you to join us for an in-person conference at Syracuse, New York on July 11th and 12th. And the details on this upcoming conference will be posted on our website very soon, along with a recording of this particular webinar and the slides. Please make sure to visit NewYorkHealthFoundation.org for more information and on this and other future events. So thank you once again for joining us and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.